Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you're joining us. It's Politico's Ryan Heath and the president of Microsoft, Brad Smith, with you for half an hour talking about democracy, digital, and pandemics. Welcome, Brad.
Thank you. Good to be here. I always actually love going to Denmark. I'm sorry I'm only participating virtually today.
It's just as good in the mind, that's what I say. Now, don't need to have a big, long introductory talk from me, but the pandemic is making us more aware of inequalities in our society. Movements like Black Lives Matter remind us of the biases in our mind and in technology, in the way it's built sometimes. And all of it's an inflection point for tech, which is doing better than ever, and it's also under more scrutiny than ever. I might kick off with something I heard you say to one of my colleagues yesterday, actually, Brad, where you talked about the social responsibility of tech, the first responsibility being first do no harm. And that sounds like quite a break from previous mentalities in the startup and the Silicon Valley world. Like we all know those slogans like move fast and break things from another company. I know it's not yours. Have I interpreted that statement right, that you're looking to do things in a different way now in tech?
Well, I think across the tech sector, we need to do things in a different way. I think there's been some gradual movement in this direction over the last year or two. And of course, it's not monolithic. Different companies have different approaches, and that remains the case today. I do think perhaps the last few months have awakened people further, but I think we're going to need a continuing awakening across the industry. I do think that our first responsibility is to do no harm. And I think our second, really almost on an equal basis, is to use technology as a tool to address the world's great challenges. And this year, I think, is shining a spotlight. Obviously, COVID-19 is unprecedented in our lifetimes. And I think it has, I think, brought out more of a focus across the industry in putting technology to work in a more positive way.
Now, we've had a lot of discussion over recent months about our essential workers as heroes. And in a funny way, it reminded me of the way that the tech world used to have that halo status. Is there something that Microsoft sees that it can do specifically to recreate that image for the technology industry? Or do you feel like you have to look after your own patch first and that you can't be responsible for everybody else and what's going on globally?
Well, the first thing I would say is, look, when you create a company, you typically found it around a mission, and the mission is to do something, provide something of value to other people. So I always think it makes more sense to start with the other people you're trying to serve. I do think that when people look back at this pandemic, at some point in the future, there will be two sets of heroes, and neither is going to be in the tech sector. The first set of heroes are people in the healthcare space. They're the ones who are not only working long hours, but putting their health on the line to be with people who are ill. And the second will probably be the scientists who invent the vaccine or therapeutic treatment advances. Those are the heroes. I think across the tech sector, we do have an important role to play. We like to think of ourselves as the digital supporters to the world's first responders. If we're fortunate and there's an Academy Awards event for all of this when it's said and done, we won't be candidates for Best Actor or Best Actress, but perhaps for some of the supporting work. And we are doing a lot of work with data, with digital technology, really to support public health authorities and all the decisions they need to make, to support the healthcare providers themselves. And there's been a lot of really interesting technology work using AI and the like to help the healthcare space, and ultimately using machine learning and the like for this research, especially perhaps to pursue a vaccine.
100%. Now, you've made some big commitments in recent days about how you are willing to have your technology used or where you don't want your technology used. So applause for that. I was wondering if you can talk through some of the details. And I guess the point I'm really trying to make is sometimes the devil is in those details where you may have existing contracts somewhere, or you don't control how someone uses your technology. So how do you keep people accountable when they interact with Microsoft or use your tools, aside from not selling them stuff in the first place?
Yeah, no, it is a fascinating and important and complex question for all the reasons you just described. And I think what you're obviously referring to is the debate that sort of sparked about a week ago in the United States around facial recognition. And IBM, Amazon, and Microsoft, in slightly different ways, each did something similar, saying that we would not provide our facial recognition services to police forces in the United States. Obviously, that was a reaction to the concerns that have, I think quite rightly garnered so much attention around Black Lives Matter. Now, we started focusing on facial recognition in a detailed way 2 years ago. We started by calling for a discussion about ethical principles needed to govern this technology. That was in July of 2018. In December of 2018, we called for legislation and even outlined what we think it would make sense to put in legislation. And we said at that time that we would apply these same principles to ourselves. And then just 3 months ago, we finally saw the first piece of legislation adopted. It's in our own state of the United States, Washington State. You might ask, well, what are the issues? I think there's really three distinct categories. One is about addressing bias. It's been documented that facial recognition services often have had higher error rates and have misidentified women and people of color. The second issue is really around protecting privacy, something that obviously is governed already in a detailed way in Europe by the GDPR, but there are some specific nuances that arise in the context of facial recognition. And I think the third perhaps speaks most directly to the theme of this event. It's so important in our view to ensure that facial recognition technology is not used in a way that would chill fundamental democratic freedoms. And it's really easy, I think, to envision how it might be used in that way. For example, it could be used to surveil everyone who is attending a peaceful protest. It could be used to then engage in ongoing surveillance of a person and follow that person literally down every street and into buildings and the like, and make it harder for that person even to meet with other people. So we early on decided that we would not allow our technology to be used in ways that would lead to bias or to the chilling of democratic freedoms. And we've repeatedly said no when we've been asked about licensing it in those cases. Last week, our announcement built on that. The one thing I would add here, though, is I think if people are interested in this, it's worth taking a look at the Washington state law. It ensures that law enforcement cannot use facial recognition to surveil a specific individual on an ongoing basis unless they first get a court order. And it says that under no circumstances can the government use facial recognition technology to surveil people who are engaging in a peaceful protest. So these are the kinds of concepts that I think reflect building blocks that I hope governments around the world, certainly in the democratic countries of the world, will consider as this technology continues to evolve.
Mm-hmm. And do you ever find, or have you heard of other company examples where the technology pops up in places you didn't expect, or there's some kind of black or secondary market where it's appearing and you have to hunt it down and reverse engineer the situation?
I haven't seen that so much, but I will say, as is often the case, the debate in the media about what companies are doing tends to focus on the names of companies that people easily recognize. So a story about IBM and Amazon and Microsoft makes news. People haven't yet realized that, frankly, none of the three of us are among the top three companies providing facial recognition technology to law enforcement. So, one of the things that I always worry about, that we've talked about for 2 years, is if the responsible companies step aside, you can still see a race to the bottom in the marketplace by others. That, in fact, is why we need a law. I think the law is the only way to guard against a race to the bottom.
Exactly. Well, actually, that brings me to my next question, which is, will those sort of regulations and laws be one of the lasting legacies of COVID-19 when it comes to surveillance, or do you see some other lasting legacies emerging around that?
Well, I think it's worth just sort of stepping back and asking for a second, what do we think the lasting legacies of COVID-19 will be? The first thing I would say is it's too early to know for certain. We should approach the question with a pretty strong dose of humility. I do think one thing to consider is that a crisis is, in this instance, perhaps not completely different from what happens when a country needs to go to war. And when you look at the history of this type of thing when it comes to technology, the first thing you tend to see is that technologies that were advancing before the crisis began, that accelerate during the crisis, tend to continue to move fast afterwards. In this case, I think it's obvious. Digital technology was moving quickly. Its adoption has accelerated. It's going to be a defining factor for this decade, perhaps even more so than the decade that we just finished. We're seeing this notion of sort of almost remote everything. People working remotely, studying remotely, purchasing things remotely. We saw that before. We should assume we'll see many aspects of that continue. I think if there's another lasting legacy, it may be around an appreciation for the use of data and the way data-driven decisions can lead to better decision-making by governments. We've never lived in our lifetimes, perhaps no one's ever lived in their lifetime, with governments using data the way public health officials have this year, literally to decide whether you could leave your home, where you could go if you left your home. We've all become very familiar with a number of concepts that, frankly, we had never heard about 6 months ago in terms of transmission rates and the like. But what we're really finding is that data is the indispensable tool for managing this public health crisis. And I think that we're finding that data can be a better and more powerful, more constructive tool for a lot of other issues like a green recovery and managing the carbon reductions that we need to pursue around the world. And what we need is more of a focus on open data that opens up data sets, that federates it among different users, and that enables better decision making while protecting privacy. And putting those concepts together, I think we've been doing more of that in recent months. I think that will be one of the legacies from all of this.
100%. And I feel like alongside the explosion of data, something the Alliance here has been very concerned about is the explosion of misinformation, disinformation, bad information, whatever label you want to put on it. Are we going to drown in that other side of the explosion of information, or is there something that we can do? And I'll be honest, is it something that we need to trust tech companies to help solve, or is that another one of those things we need to regulate on?
Well, the first thing I would say is I do think that we've seen as a result of this pandemic, some continuing evolution in the nature of, particularly of nation state attacks. We follow this very closely and we work very actively to combat it. And interestingly, we saw a fall in nation state attacks in March. It was as if the employees of the groups engaged in that at first had to go home and weren't able to do the same job from home, but within a few weeks they adjusted. And we've seen a resurgence and really an expansion in nation state attacks in April, in May, and in the first half of June. We've seen some broadening of the governments engaged in this. I think that's not encouraging. But mostly we've seen a small number of authoritarian governments engage in nation state attacks, including at a more aggressive rate. We've seen an expansion of the targets that they've been focused on. We have seen governments attacking public health authorities from the local level all the way to the global level. We've seen attacks on hospitals. So it unfortunately, I think, is just adding to the woes that we faced when the year began. Fundamentally, I think it calls on all of us to do more. This is not a problem that any company or group of companies or even any government by itself can solve by itself. It's going to require continued multi-stakeholder action. We're certainly focused at Microsoft on our Defending Democracy program, on securing elections, on voting, on fighting misinformation, on protecting candidates and campaigns. But we've also rolled out additional protections the last couple of months for hospitals and healthcare authorities. And we've joined the International Committee of the Red Cross in calling for the UN ceasefire and pleading with governments to leave healthcare providers alone during this pandemic.
On the election front, Bing and LinkedIn, two of your products or product lines, have been very clear in not accepting political advertising. What's your outlook on the 2020 election, including how you deal with things like deep fakes, and why have you been so strict on that when other companies have a more laissez-faire approach to it?
Well, first, starting with our approach to political advertising, we just don't think it's something that the world needs on these online platforms. There's plenty of opportunities for candidates running for office to reach the public and to advertise on other forms of media. We think that the risks of disinformation rise when you have political advertising on these kinds of platforms. It gives me great pause to just think about the nature of targeting of individual voters. I think one of the questions that every democracy should consider is whether there should be limits on the ability of any candidate running for office to precisely target individual voters with paid political ads. I think it's one thing to target a postal code. We've been able to do that since basically there was the post office with postal codes. You reach everyone who lives in a defined area. But when you start targeting with political ads, people with very precise characteristics based on age or based on race or based on certain political beliefs, you start to create these information bubbles where different people are being exposed to entirely different information sets about what's happening in the world. And I think one of the fundamental tenets that's been essential for the success of democracy over the last few centuries has been that we value, even treasure a diversity of opinions and ideas, but we need a voting public that also all has access to a basically common set of information about what's happening in the world. And I think paid political advertising on social media platforms can put that fundamental part of democracy at risk. So that's one aspect of this. As I look to the next few months in the United States, we'll almost certainly see a lot of debates and arguments about misinformation. And we'll see, I think, sustained nation-state attacks, more sophisticated nation-state attacks in 2020 than we saw in 2016. Mm-hmm. We may see the use of deep fakes. I think we need to be prepared for that. We haven't seen it yet, but we need to be prepared for that. And then there's the ultimate concern that I believe we should worry about every day. And that would be a nation-state attack that tampers with a voter roll, that would eliminate the ability of people to vote if they turn up on at the polls on election day, or even worse, that would tamper with the voting results. I think that is the true version of a digital 9/11, and that is what we need to continue to do more to protect against, not just in the United States, but in every one of the 76 democratic nations around the world.
100%. And my takeaway from that is that we have national elections now, but we often don't have national conversations. So that's a really interesting point. It's time to bring in an audience question now. Chris Grant asks, who is winning the AI race? So I think he means globally, in company terms, in country terms.
Well, I think it's a little early to declare victors, but you could certainly ask, as you have, who's in the lead at the moment. Yeah, the first thing I would say is it's easy to look at the United States and China as the two countries that have the most companies that are developing AI technology. I think most people would agree with that, and they would probably put the United States in the first position and China in the second position. But I would then hasten to say that the situation is actually a lot more complicated than that, and that's actually a good thing. There's one part of the AI race that involves the creation of the technology and tools that will be used for machine learning or facial recognition or other AI-based services. That's the way people start to talk about this. But frankly, the more important part of the race, the broader part of the race, is probably going to be about who uses AI the most effectively to transform their economy and make it more competitive. Now, I will say China does a very good job not only of creating AI technology, but adopting it. When I go to China, I'm struck by how quickly Chinese companies in the private sector are moving and the breadth of that movement. But this is the part that I think is especially important for Europe. Europe will be a substantial participant in the creation of AI technologies. But if you think about all of the industry sectors in which Europe is a leader, think of the industry sectors in which Danish companies are leaders. It really spans many different parts of the economy. And every one of these industry sectors will almost certainly be transformed by AI over the course of this decade and the decade to follow. And so I think the real question is, where are each of these sectors in adopting AI? The answer is at an early stage. Mm-hmm. Now, the good news is around the world, most industry sectors are at an early stage. So I think the real question is, where will they be in 5 years? What is the right way to deploy AI? I know from my own visits to Microsoft in Denmark, we are working with more parts of the Danish economy, with more companies in Denmark. And I think Denmark is and can be a leader in this space, including, I might add, in the connection between AI and sustainability, where Denmark is, I think, a global leader in terms of a focus on these things. So I'm optimistic about what we will see in Europe and in Denmark in this kind of space, but there's an enormous opportunity and a huge amount of work ahead.
We've got a question on the institutional aspects of all of that from Robert Wild, and he points out that there has been an idea put forward by Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who we all know from this conference, Boris Johnson, even from invitations from Donald Trump to the G7, to create a club of democracies, sometimes known as the D10. And I think the intent behind that is to look for alternatives to China on 5G and in other areas like AI and facial recognition. Do you think there's a case for democracies to caucus together like that around these technologies?
Well, I do think that this is a time when the world's democracies need to work together. And I'm not going to claim expertise in the right way to create an institution to bring the world's democracies together, but we see every day the need for more collaboration across the world's democracies. I think that democracy is under attack today by certain authoritarian governments around the world. For many decades, I think we all looked at something like communications technology, the radio, the television, even the fax machine, as fundamental tools that were spreading democracy around the world. But I think with the internet and with social media platforms, we see democracies actually facing an asymmetric threat from authoritarian regimes. And I think the democratic countries of the world have to work together to fight back. There's a variety of ways for them to strengthen their defenses, and we think that's important. We welcome the efforts by the democratic governments of the world to call out those countries and hold them accountable when they engage in nation-state attacks. And we've seen that since 2017 and 2018, starting with the NotPetya attack, for example. We, I think, need to do more. I think we need to strengthen the international legal framework to address the kinds of attacks on political processes that these governments are pursuing by attacking our democracies. That's why we've called for what we've termed a digital Geneva Convention. And I think that there are many other areas where the world's democracies can share information and be more effective together. I think the 5G.
How would that digital Geneva Convention work? Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, we've actually been making progress over the past couple of years, I think, in strengthening the norms that govern what nation states can do when it comes to attacking others. We were really gratified when the Paris call was adopted in November of 2018. That's now been signed by roughly 70 nations and more than 1,000 participants overall, businesses, nonprofit organizations around the world. We've seen the creation now of a Cyber Peace Institute in Geneva, a new non-governmental organization that is working across the world's democracies to share expertise and the like. So we're seeing some of the building blocks emerge for what I think the world is going to need over the course of the next decade. And we as a company have been one of the first to call for these kinds of efforts and have been very involved in working to advance them.
Brad, I want to thank you for your time. It's almost time for us to welcome Secretary of State Mike Pompeo now. So thanks for joining us. We hope you can stick around for that conversation. And for all of you watching, we'll now take a short break and we'll be back with the Secretary of State.
Great. Thank you.